Rain swept in from the sea, hurling itself against the fringe market of Theverus 5, until the cobbled lanes became shallow, hurrying streams. The smell of rust and salt and wet rope wove through the air, clinging to every awning and oilskin coat. Canvas stalls strained against their moorings, their merchants hunched like wary gulls over whatever stock might still draw coin in the storm. In that gray churn of bodies and weather, a violet-skinned woman stood apart. Lyrian's silver hair lay in damp, tangled ropes down her back, each strand catching what little light filtered through the cloud ceiling. Her chin was lifted, her gaze fixed forward, though the cold soaked through the thin tunic she wore. In her hands she held a strip of deep purple silk, no wider than her palm, and frayed at both ends, what remained of a ceremonial sash once worn on festival days in her homeland. It was all she had left that spoke of who she had been before the storms of fate had brought her here. Beside her, a small girl pressed close, thin arms wrapped around herself for warmth. Sel's bare feet curled against the stones, toes pale. From the chill, Lyrian shifted the silk to one hand, cupping the other protectively over her daughter's head as another gust swept cold. Rain sideways through the market dot. The soup vendor's eyes lingered on the silk. A battered ladle paused mid-stir over the vat of steaming broth. 2 bowls, the vendor said, voice low but certain. For that? Lyrian's jaw tightened. The strip had been knotted at her waist for 3 years, a talisman against despair. But Sel's small body shivered beside her, and the wind cut through like a blade. She untied the silk with slow, deliberate fingers and placed it into the vendor's waiting hand. In return, she received 1 dented tin bowl, broth rising in clouds of heat. She crouched, pressing it into Sel's hands. Drink slowly. Sel obeyed, blowing at the steam before sipping, her eyes closing at the taste. Lyrian did not take even a sip, watching instead for any sign of trouble in the press of strangers. From under the overhang of a dockside warehouse, Cale Roar watched. Them. He had finished his shift an hour before, hands still aching from hauling cargo nets heavy with machine parts. He was not a man easily distracted. His living depended on reading the movement of crates, manifests and crews, but he'd made a habit of reading the market too. Some things didn't move on ledgers. What caught him wasn't the silk or the girl, but the way the woman held herself proud despite the cold, quiet despite the hunger. No begging, no appeals. She would rather give away the last thing she owned than admit she had nothing. When Sel's bowl was empty, Cale stepped from the shelter. There's an unused shed down by the docks, he said over the wind. Dry, out of the weather. Lyrian's silver eyes narrowed, assessing. We do not take charity. It's not charity, he said. It's empty space. Costs me nothing. She shook her head once, a quick dismissal. Pride still intact, suspicion stronger. Cale hesitated, ready to turn away, when Sel's small voice rose between them. Does it have a floor? The question hung there, light as breath, and Lyrian's gaze flickered, just once toward her daughter. The first crack in the walls she'd built. The rain had not eased by the time Cale led them toward the docks. But the streets here were quieter, the crowds thinned to the few who had no choice but to work in this weather. Lanterns swayed in the air. Wind, their light rippling over the wet planks of the quay. The tang of brine and tar grew sharper with every step, the air colder as it came unhindered off the open water. L-I-R-I and kept Sel close, one hand steady on the girl's shoulder, the other at her side, as if ready to ward off anything that might emerge from the shadows. Cale noticed how her eyes moved, always scanning corners, doorways, the gaps between crates, like someone who'd had reason to fear those spaces before. The shed stood apart from the main line of warehouses, squat and weather-worn, its corrugated walls streaked with rust. The lock was an old pad with a broken latch. Cale pulled the door open, revealing a single room with a plank floor and a smell of dust and salt. It was dark, except for a thin seam of gray light at the roofline where the metal had warped. "It's not much," he said, stepping inside first. "But it's dry, and no one uses it. Not even the gulls bother with it." Sel padded in, her bare feet leaving tiny wet prints. She tested the boards with a little hop, then another, and grinned up at her mother. "It has a floor." Lyrian followed more slowly. She stood in the center, turning once, her fingers brushing the wall, and no leaks. "I can bring you a tarp, some blankets," Cale offered, leaning on the doorframe. "And something for the girl's feet." She looked at him directly then, and for the first time he saw more than guarded suspicion in her expression. There was calculation, yes, but also a flicker of something quieter, maybe relief, though she buried it quickly. "Why?" "Because you're cold, she's colder, and I've got more blankets than I need." Her gaze lingered a moment longer, measuring him, and then she nodded once. "For her," she said, "not for me." Cale didn't argue. He left them there, locking the door from the outside with a makeshift wire twist to discourage curious drunks. On his way back up the dock, he passed a knot of dockhands taking shelter in the lee of a warehouse. They watched him go by with that speculative look men get when they've seen something worth gossiping about. He ignored them. When he returned, arms full of rolled tarp, 2 worn blankets, a pair of mismatched boots, Lyrian had the girl sitting on the floor with her back to the wall, knees tucked to her chest. Sel's head lolled against her mother's shoulder. The exhaustion of warmth and food finally overtaking her. Cale set the bundle down quietly. Lyrian's eyes followed every movement, but she said nothing as he spread the tarp against the drafty wall and laid one blanket over it. The boots he placed neatly to the side. "Storm last through morning," he said, keeping his voice low so as not to wake Sel. "I'll check on you after my shift." She inclined her head, a gesture just short of thanks. As he stepped out into the rain again, Cale wondered if that shed would still be empty tomorrow, or if, for the first time in a long while, it would be a place someone called theirs. The storm broke at dawn, leaving the air sharp with the scent of wet stone and brine. Puddles glazed the dockside in sheets of pale light, and the gulls were back, their cries mingling with the creak of mooring lines. Cale's shift started early, hauling cargo nets from a deep-bellied freighter newly arrived from the inner colonies. But his thoughts kept drifting toward the shed at the far end of the quay dot by midday. He found an excuse to walk that way, a coil of rope slung over his shoulder for show. The door was still secured with the wire twist he'd left, which he unwound quietly before stepping inside. Lyrian was awake, seated cross-legged on the floor with Sel still wrapped in a blanket. Beside her, the girl's head nestled against her mother's lap. The boots he'd brought lay untouched in the corner. "You didn't use them," Cale said, nodding toward the boots. Lyrian's silver gaze lifted to his, steady and unblinking. "They're too large for her. She could trip on the docks." "I could stuff the toes?" he suggested. Her lips pressed together in a faint, skeptical line, as if she were weighing whether the offer carried some hidden bargain. "She has feet enough to walk," Lyrian said finally. "It is more than some can claim." He studied her a moment, noting the way she sat shoulders back despite fatigue, chin lifted as though she still stood in some ceremonial hall instead of a half-rotted dock shed. Pride wasn't just armor for her. It was her spine. "I can bring food," he offered. "Bread, dried fish, maybe some fruit if the market's fair. That would be acceptable." The pause before the last word was deliberate, as if she were granting him a minor concession in some larger negotiation. Sel stirred then, blinking sleepily. Her small voice broke the stillness. "Is it morning?" "It is," Cale said, crouching. beside them, and clear skies for now. Want to see the harbor? Sel looked to her mother first, and only when Lyrian inclined her head did she nod. Kale held out his hand, but she simply stood and slipped her fingers into her mother's instead. He noticed, though, that her eyes flicked toward the light beyond the door with curiosity rather than fear. They stepped outside together, and the change in Sel was immediate. She lifted her face to the breeze, her luminous patterns brightening, faintly under her skin like water catching the sun. Lyrian watched her, and for a heartbeat, Kale caught something unguarded in her expression, the barest hint of relief that her daughter could still smile. Back at the market, the afternoon crowd was already thickening. Kale bought bread from a stall where he knew the owner wouldn't ask questions, slipping an extra roll into the sack when the man turned away. "You don't have to," Lyrian said as he handed her the bundle. "I know," he replied, "but I will." Her eyes lingered on him a moment longer than before, not softened, but no longer as sharp. Perhaps, Kale thought, the walls were shifting stone by stone, crack by crack. That night the docks were quieter, the wind a low hum through, the rigging and the slap of water against hulls the only steady sound. Kale's shift had ended hours earlier, but he lingered in the market until most stalls had closed, collecting a small bag of odds and ends bread crusts from one baker, a wedge of hard cheese from another, a dented tin cup traded for a bit of rope. When he reached the shed, the wire twist was in place, but the faint glow from inside told him they were awake. He rapped lightly on the metal, then opened the door. Sel sat cross-legged on the tarp, arranging smooth pebbles in careful lines. Lyrian was beside her, mending a tear in the blanket with neat, tight stitches made from a length of unraveled twine. "I thought I'd bring you something," Kale sighed, setting the bag down. Sel's eyes lit, her patterns brightening under her violet skin. Lyrian's gaze flicked to the bundle, but she kept her hands still, as if waiting for some formal permission to take it. "It's nothing fancy," Kale added, pulling out the bread and cheese, "but it'll keep you warm through the night." Lyrian took the food, placed a small portion in Sel's lap, and set the rest aside. "You keep nothing for yourself," Kale observed. Her silver eyes found his. "I eat after my child. That is the way of my people." They ate in silence for a time, the soft sound of Sel chewing mingling with the creak of the shed walls in the wind. When the girl had finished, she went back to her pebbles, arranging them into a spiral pattern. "You're good with your hands," Kale said, nodding toward the repair work in Lyrian's lap. "Every skill was once survival," she replied simply. Tying off the stitch, he leaned back against the wall, watching her work. "This place, it's not much better than the streets, but it's dry, and I can make it better. Board the cracks, lay a mat. You could stay until you find somewhere else." Her needle paused mid-her. "You speak as though I have the choice to move freely." "You don't?" A shadow passed over her face. "We came here on the supply barge. We have no papers, no sponsor. Without either, the city is a cage, even if its doors are open." It clicked then, why she watched corners, why she refused charity. Anything too public could bring the wrong attention. "I've worked these docks for years," Kale said. "I know the people who don't ask questions. I can keep you under the watch." She regarded him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she said, "For her," and her gaze shifted to Sel. Kale nodded, feeling the faintest weight of trust settle between them. Outside, the wind rattled the shed's loose panels, but inside, for the first time, the air felt less like a place to pass through and more like the beginnings of a refuge. The days that followed unfolded in a rhythm neither of them had expected. Kale rose before dawn for his shift, the scent of salt and tar clinging to him when he returned at midday with food or small supplies. Lyrian, in turn, kept the shed neat and dry, arranging Cell's sleeping space with the precision of someone determined to make dignity out of scraps. Cell had taken to sitting on the dock's edge in the afternoons, watching ships slide in and out with a fascination that made her glow faintly beneath her skin. Cale would sometimes linger with her, pointing out the markings of distant colony vessels or explaining how the tide pulled the big freighters sideways against their moorings. Lyrian always kept within arm's reach, her gaze steady on every passerby. One evening, Cale returned later than usual, a shallow cut on his cheek and a split along his knuckles. Lyrian was standing in the doorway before he reached the shed. "What happened?" Her voice carried no softness, only demand. "Dockside dispute," he said. "Cargo weights got changed mid-haul. Foreman's nephew took offense when I called him on it." Her eyes narrowed. "And you fought him?" "Not for long. He'll bruise more than I will." She stepped back, allowing him inside, but her attention lingered on the blood drying along his knuckles. Without a word, she fetched a small strip of cloth she'd torn from the frayed hem of the tarp and dipped it in the water jug. Sitting opposite him, she took his hand before he could protest and began cleaning the skin with careful, precise motions. "You should have let it go," she said quietly. He studied her, trying to read what lay beneath the words. "That's not really my way." Her hands paused for a fraction of a second before she resumed. "It will be harder for you if you are noticed. Harder still if those who notice know you help us." Cale caught her gaze and held it. "Maybe I don't mind being noticed for the right reasons." Something flickered in her expression, quick and hard to name, before she set the cloth aside. "You risked too much, and you think doing nothing is safer?" "I think," she said, her tone like tempered steel, "that survival often depends on knowing when not to fight." Cell appeared from her corner then, holding two of her smooth pebbles. She placed one in Cale's palm and one in her mother's before curling back into her blanket. The gesture was simple, but Cale saw the weight of it in offering, perhaps the only thing the child had to give. Lyrian looked down at the pebble in her hand, then at Cale's matching one. "She doesn't do that often," she murmured. Cale closed his fingers around the small stone. "Then I'll keep it safe." Outside, the tide shifted, the dock ropes creaking in the dark. Inside the shed, the silence between them was no longer wary. It had begun to feel like the pause between one word and the next, waiting for what might come. The storm that had first driven them together returned in the night, rolling in from the sea with a low, relentless growl. Rain drummed on the corrugated roof, each gust of wind making the walls shiver. Inside, the shed was warmer now. Cale had boarded the worst of the gaps, and Lyrian had hung strips of canvas to break the drafts, but it still felt small when the wind howled. Cell slept curled against her mother, wrapped in both blankets, her breathing soft and steady. Cale sat near the door, oil lamp casting a shallow glow, mending a length of dock line out of habit more than need. He had learned that quiet work kept the air easy between them. When the knock came, it was barely audible under the storm. Cale froze, the rope coiling slack in his hands. Lyrian's eyes met his, sharp and alert. Another knock, harder this time, followed by a man's voice muffled by the rain. "Dockmaster wants the shed cleared." "Got word someone's squatting here?" Cale's jaw tightened. He rose, stepping to the door without looking back. "This space isn't under Dockmaster's claim," he called, keeping his tone flat. Short laugh came from the other side. "Everything on the quay's under his claim. Move her along, or I'll bring a patrol." Cale opened the door just enough to see the man, a broad-shouldered hauler he recognized from the North Pier, one who liked to work favors for petty officials. The man's eyes flicked past him, narrowing when they found Lyrian in the lamplight. "Ah, thought so. One of them." "You need to leave," Cale said, stepping into the gap. "She's got no papers, Roar. You keep her here. You're asking for trouble. The old reflex to back down rose up, but Cale held his ground. You don't see anyone here. That's how you avoid trouble. The man's smirk thinned. Suit yourself. Don't say I didn't warn you. He turned, boots splashing away into the night. Cale shut the door and set the wire twist back in place. Lyrian hadn't moved, but her eyes were on him with an intensity that made the air feel close. You could have let him take me, she said. I could have, he agreed. Why didn't you? He sat again, meeting her gaze across the small pool of lamplight. Because you're here, because Cell is, and because this is my dock, as much as it's theirs. They don't get to decide who belongs. Something in her posture eased, the stiffness in her shoulders giving way to a measured breath. Then, you've made yourself part of our fate, she said softly. Maybe, he allowed, but I think it works both ways. She studied him a moment longer, then reached across the narrow space and placed something in his palm. It was one of Cell's pebbles, smooth and warm from her hand. Then keep this. If you carry it, you'll find your way back, no matter the tide. The rain battered the roof, the lamp's flame guttered, and Cale closed his fingers around the stone. Outside, the storm would pass. Inside, the shed no longer felt like a stopgap. It felt, against all odds, like the beginning of a home.